One of them has been licensed recently, a phosphodiesterase 4 inhibitor called roflumilast, which might have some role in the management of COPD patients in terms of curbing this inflammatory response. And one of the most important things which have emerged over the last 10 years is the fact that COPD is not a disease only restricted to the lungs, but it also has very profound systemic consequences. It affects other systems. And I won't touch upon most of them, but probably just touch upon some of them in terms of how it affects the systemic activity. So, just to put it in a cartoon form, it's a disease, as I said, which is preventable to some extent and treatable, predominantly caused by cigarette smoking. There is airflow limitation, which is progressive, but which is partially reversible. Rather than looking at a half empty glass, I would look at a half full glass and say that it is partially reversible. It may not be fully reversible. There is an abnormal inflammatory response, so we can do something to curb this abnormal inflammatory response. And the systemic consequences also need to be addressed and treated in these patients. Now, the fundamental treatment aspect of COPD management is smoking cessation. This is the only intervention which can impact mortality in COPD without any doubt. The other interventions in COPD have not shown to impact mortality hugely. Maybe some tantalizing clue as to whether they impact mortality. But regarding smoking cessation, there is such a huge amount of data that it impacts mortality in COPD that it is worth doing in every patient. And this is the classical slide of Fletcher and Pito, which was published in the BMJ more than 35 years ago, which showed that stopping smoking is useful at any stage of the disease. This is the curves of decline in lung function. This is non-smokers, and this is what happens in susceptible smokers. So you can see there is a much more steeper decline in lung function. So if a patient stops smoking at any age, you're going to reduce the slope of this decline. So you will always give this patient some time. You buy time. Whenever they stop smoking, even at the old age, you can buy them a few more years. So I think effort put in smoking cessation is extremely important. And it is the most effective intervention in the management of COPD. You can see that stopping smoking reduces the rate of decline in FEV1 by half. The decline from 50 ml to the normal decline of about 25 ml per year. Sudden smoke cessation has always a better success rate than gradually stopping smoking. Most patients will tell you, we are going to stop smoking gradually. But that never works because they suddenly start again increasing their smoking. So stopping smoking suddenly has a better success rate, and it is a very cost-effective intervention. This was a calculation done by a Health Economics Institute in the UK, where they looked at a number of medical interventions, starting from transplants to bypass to dialysis. And what they said is per life year gain, the cheapest medical intervention is smoking cessation. It only costs £700 in the UK to gain a year of life by focusing on stopping smoking. Whereas you can see the average of 310 medical interventions, the cost was £17,000 per year. So it's extremely cost effective in terms of the outcome. Now, after stopping smoking, the most important treatment in terms of COPD is the use of bronchodilators. They are the first line therapy in the management of symptomatic COPD, and bronchodilators work in a variety of physiological ways. The most important sort of mechanism of action of bronchodilators in terms of improving exercise tolerance is the so-called reduction in dynamic hyperinflation. We all know that in COPD, the lungs are hyperinflated, and that imposes a mechanical disadvantage to the whole ventilatory system. So you have a flattened diaphragm which moves less, and by giving bronchodilators, you can reduce this dynamic hyperinflation. And by reduction of dynamic hyperinflation, you actually increase respiratory capacity. And this is what allows a patient to exercise more. The work of breathing is reduced, the ventilatory capacity is improved, and dyspnea is reduced both at rest and during exercise. Now, there are various bronchodilators available. The anticholinergics are very important in COPD. In asthma, it is the beta-2 agonists which are more important. But in COPD, perhaps the anticholinergics are more important. And we have short-acting ones and long-acting ones. So you have ipratropium and tiotropium, which is a long-acting one. Then we have the long-acting beta agonist, salmeterol, formoterol, and now indacaterol, which is a once-a-day long-acting beta agonist. And then we have short-acting beta agonists. We all know salbutamol. We can use any of these combinations, and also theophylline. Now, tiotropium has been a very important addition in the armamentarium in the management of COPD. And this was once initial study which showed that there was a significant increase in FEV1 over the baseline of about 12% using tiotropium, and patients were less dyspneic, had a superior health status, and had a fewer exacerbations and hospitalization. And this has been shown to be very representative across most studies, including perhaps one of the largest studies of tiotropium called the UPLIFT study. And you can see that compared to the short-acting anticholinergics, it is much more effective in terms of improvement in lung function. And also in terms of improvement in exercise duration, right from the first dose, there is a significant improvement in terms of what a patient can do in terms of exercise capacity. So various studies have shown that compared to placebo, compared to ipratropium, and even compared to the long-acting beta agonist, there is a slightly superior result in terms of FEV1, FVC, and reduction of exacerbations if we use tiotropium. The long-acting beta agonists are also important in the management of this disease, and in many of these patients, they replace the short-acting drugs like salbutamol because you can give it as a maintenance therapy. They have an additive effect with anticholinergic, so you can combine the two, and it can also be combined in the same inhaler with inhaled corticosteroids in severe cases. And just to illustrate the point, that when you combine a long-acting beta agonist like salmeterol and an anticholinergic, you get a superior beneficial effect as compared to when you use one of them alone. So patients with moderate to severe symptoms of COPD are better off if you give them a combination of inhalers, predominantly a long-acting beta agonist and a long-acting anticholinergic. The ideal inhaler, if we had one, would be a combination of once-a-day anticholinergic like tiotropium with once-a-day long-acting beta agonists such as indacaterol. But we still don't have a combination of these two in the same inhaler because worldwide they are made by two different companies. So because of patent reasons, I think in the West it's not possible to combine. But in future, I think there are some molecules in the pipeline where you will be able to see that these two are present in the same inhaler. Now, the next pharmacological agent we use in COPD is inhaled corticosteroids. Now, inhaled corticosteroids, as all of us know, are the first line management in asthma. In COPD, that is not really the case because, as I'll talk to you about in a few subsequent slides. But if we look at one's Canadian database, this was across because in Canada, all their prescriptions are kept in a database, and one can sort of mine this database and look at what various agents are doing. So if inhaled corticosteroids were used compared to no corticosteroids, even in COPD patients, this is mind you not asthma, you can see that hospitalization-free survival was higher as a group in those patients who were given inhaled corticosteroids. And although it did not lead to sort of significant levels in terms of statistical significance, both mortality and readmission was lower in this group of patients who were on inhaled corticosteroids. Now, steroids in COPD, all of us use it during an exacerbation. There have not really been very large studies of the role of steroids in acute exacerbation of COPD. There are certain small studies which have been grouped together in a meta-analysis, and it shows that short courses of systemic steroids in acute exacerbation improve spirometric outcomes. That means they improve the lung function at a quicker rate than if you did not use steroids, and they also improve the clinical outcomes. So maybe a 2-week course of oral steroids is what we need in COPD exacerbations, but not at a very high dose. Most of the studies have been done with prednisolone, about 40 milligrams a day. but not, sometimes I see patients on 125 milligrams 3 times a day, 40 milligrams 3 times a day. That will lead to myopathy more than helping their COPD. Again, this was one of the older studies of COPD and steroids, the so-called ISOLT study, which again showed that using fluticasone reduced the exacerbation rate in COPD patients. And this was another study called the Tristan study, which again showed the same thing, that if you use inhaled corticosteroid or a combination of salmeterol and fluticasone as compared to a placebo, your risk of exacerbations was reduced. So from only inhaled corticosteroids, we come to a combination of long-acting beta agonists and inhaled corticosteroids, like the one you have in front of you, Seretide. This was one study looking at about 1,500 patients, which again showed that the significant improvement occurred in terms of lung function, in terms of symptoms, in terms of reducing exacerbations, and improving the overall health status as measured by the St. George's Respiratory Questionnaire. And the pivotal study, this combination, was a so-called TORCH study, which showed again the same kind of outcome, and also showed that maybe it also impacts in terms of reducing mortality. So inhaled steroids in COPD should not be used alone. They are not the first line therapy. They should not be used in very mild COPD. So moderate to severe COPD, we say usually when the FEV1 is less than 50% of predicted. If patients have had more than 2 exacerbations every year, and in some group of patients there may be an overlap of COPD and asthma, in this group you may use it even if the airflow obstruction is not very severe. Thiophenylates have been used for a very, very long time in our country, and they still continue to be used. I've been told that they are still growing at more than 20% per year. So thiophenylates, especially in the rural areas and a lot of semi-urban areas. Now, they are not the first line bronchodilators, but in some patients they may have an additional benefit, because occasionally you have this so-called small airways disease where the inhaled bronchodilators may not work very well, and a systemic drug like thiophenylates might be more effective. And recently, again, there has been some interest in the role of thiophenylates as an anti-inflammatory drug. And Peter Barnes has taken up very strong sort of cudgels on behalf of thiophenylates and is now doing a lot of work looking at its anti-inflammatory role. And this is just to show you one small study which was done with thiophenylates in COPD, which showed some improvement in FEV1 and by reducing the dynamic hyperinflation, as I told you. However, all of us are aware of the problems of thiophenylates. We know that it has a very narrow therapeutic range, and this can lead to side effects, and there are a lot of drug interactions, and we still don't know what is the exact mechanism of action of thiophenylates. The other molecule which we have been using in COPD is N-acetylcysteine, and there are some studies which have looked at the role of N-acetylcysteine in COPD at a dose of 600 milligrams a day, not the larger doses which are sometimes used in interstitial lung diseases, but the smaller dose of 600 milligrams a day, which showed that as compared to placebo, there was a lower decline in lung function, and the amount of exacerbations were reduced slightly if you used 600 milligrams of N-acetylcysteine. However, the evidence base for this is not very, very strong, and that is why GOLD has given this evidence level B. But it is a fairly harmless drug, and I think it's worthwhile using this in those patients who have frequent exacerbations despite optimal COPD therapy. Now, I told you a little while ago that COPD is basically a pulmonary disease, but it has significant systemic manifestations. And that is why you cannot only manage COPD based on parameters which look only at lung function. For example, the FEV1, the amount of dynamic hyperinflation. These are important, but these are not the only issues when we look at COPD. So for this reason, an index has been proposed called the BORD index. And what this incorporates is 4 parameters. So one looks at the body mass index, because it has been shown that the thinner a patient with COPD is, the worse is the outcome. We look at the airflow obstruction, look at the symptomatic dyspnea and the exercise capacity. And each is given a score. And based on this score, you can prognosticate very well because it gives you an idea of the whole person rather than just the lungs. And it can predict both the risk of death and the degree of utilization of healthcare resources much better. So I think in future we are going to probably have management tools which look at much more than lung function when we are managing these patients. Skeletal muscle dysfunction is very common in COPD, as this is one of the systemic manifestations of this disease. Osteoporosis is also much more common in COPD than in the general population. And because of skeletal muscle dysfunction, it obviously impacts on the patient's exercise tolerance. And that is where this whole pulmonary rehabilitation came in. The whole idea of pulmonary rehabilitation is how to improve the exercise capacity of patients, and it includes various types of treatment modalities, including exercise training, nutrition, and maybe anabolic agents. So the aim of pulmonary rehab is to reduce symptoms, improve the functional ability, and improve the overall health status. And this is a multidisciplinary involvement which includes physiotherapy, which includes education, which includes nutrition, and also cognitive behavioral therapy, because a large number of patients with COPD are depressed or they are very anxious. Whenever somebody gets breathless on walking, the first instinct is for that patient to walk less. But unfortunately, that is a wrong kind of approach, because that will lead to further deconditioning and further worsening. And the family members, out of concern and care, are the first to say, you don't have to walk, we will do this job for you, we'll do this thing for you. But it should actually be the opposite. The patient should be made to encourage and encouraged to do more. And this is where the benefit of pulmonary rehabilitation comes, because then they can get in a lot more focused way. The only problem is in our country, we don't really have a lot of centers which are engaging in pulmonary rehabilitation. And I find it very difficult to motivate patients. Like we have one, for example, program in BM Builder, but to ask them to come 5 days a week for 3 to 4 weeks or 6 weeks is a very, very difficult job, because who will bring them every day for this kind of exercise? So that is one of the big stumbling blocks. So I think what might work in our country is short periods of rehab in a controlled environment, and then somehow encouraging them to continue doing this at home. So pulmonary rehabilitation is again a very, very cost-effective medical intervention. It actually saves money to the healthcare system rather than spending. And that is why there is a negative cost per quality adjusted life year. So the healthcare systems which are, for example, funded by the government, so in the UK it's the National Health Service, so they have to pay for everything. So by using pulmonary rehab, actually the health service can save money rather than spending money, because it reduces the cost of managing COPD patients. As the patient's COPD worsens, they become hypoxemic, they start developing pulmonary hypertension, then they will need long-term oxygen therapy. And these two were the pivotal trials, very old trials, looking at the role of long-term oxygen therapy. And they showed that you have to use oxygen for 15 hours a day or more once there is persistent daytime hypoxemia. So PO2 is less than 55 millimeters or less than 60 with features of pulmonary hypertension, then patients need oxygen for more than 15 hours a day. And this again has been shown unequivocally to impact mortality. Non-invasive positive pressure ventilation in the last 15 years again has been a very important tool in the management of COPD. In terms of acute exacerbations, hypercapnic respiratory failure, there is now great evidence across multiple studies showing the benefit. However, the role of non-invasive ventilation as a long-term management tool at home is still a little controversial. There is not absolutely unequivocal data that it impacts mortality, but there are multiple small studies which show that they do improve arterial blood gases, reduce hospitalization, and probably improve survival. So especially those patients who are admitted to hospital repeatedly with hypercapnic respiratory failure, I think this is something which we can consider as a long-term management tool at home. And there are a large number of patients who all of us have who are at home with long-term BiPAP ventilation. Surgery is an option we have in very few patients with COPD. If there is a large bulla, we can consider a bulectomy. Lung volume reduction surgery was popular for a group of patients who have severe COPD. And in fact, a very large trial was done in the West, the so-called NET study, the National Emphysema Treatment Trial, which looked at reducing the volume of the lungs. All of us know that in COPD, the predominant problem is dynamic hyperinflation, and that imposes a mechanical disadvantage on the ventilatory system. So if you can actually reduce the size of the lungs by chopping off portions of it, you can improve the whole dynamics and improve the ventilatory capacity. But it requires a fair amount of expertise and proper patient selection. You can't do it if your transfer factor is less than 20% and your FEV1 should be less than 35% but more than 20% of predicted. So in a very small group of patients there might be a role, and lung transplant I think is more of a theoretical discussion than practical so far as our country is concerned. Now I mentioned to you about influenza vaccination. This is also something which all of us can do very easily. It's now very easily available, the influenza vaccines, and influenza infection, all of us know, usually lead to secondary bacterial infection in a proportion of patients, especially with chronic lung disease. And its efficacy, especially in the elderly, across all forms of respiratory diseases has been shown. So there is a significant reduction in respiratory illness, pneumonia, hospitalization, deaths, especially in the elderly. And the effectiveness of influenza vaccination in COPD, again, multiple studies have shown that you can reduce the hospitalization rate by an exacerbation rate by vaccinating these patients on a yearly basis. And similarly, I haven't sort of shown here, but the pneumococcal vaccine can also be used in all these patients. Now, the GOLD guidelines, so we've discussed about what can be used in COPD, and as per guidelines, these are not recommended for chronic treatment of COPD. There is no role of, any role of epilytics, promons, long-term antibiotics, although there is a caveat. There are some studies which show that in patients with very frequent exacerbations, the use of low-dose long-term azithromycin might reduce their exacerbation rate. So I think there are some more studies which are being conducted looking at this. So it might be an option in those patients who come to the hospital very frequently with an infective exacerbation. And antitussives, unfortunately, are not of any use in COPD patients. Now, one of